God bless from the Victory Bells.
Well, good evening. It's great to have everyone here in the National World War II Museum's U.S. Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center, for the closing banquet and the conversation of our 18th International Conference on World War II. I'd like to thank the Victory Bells for providing fantastic entertainment tonight to finish this weekend in style. Thank you, ladies. In fact, let's give them a round of applause. I know we've all enjoyed our time in the Madeline Paul Hilliard Conference Center for the past few days, so please join me in thanking both Paul and Madeline for making the space possible and for all of their support for the museum. Along those lines, I'd like to end the conference as we begin it by recognizing Paul for his service in the United States Marine Corps during World War II. Paul flew 45 missions as a radio man and gunner in the plane just like this one over us, the SPD Dauntless dive bomber. Paul, I don't know how we can ever thank you enough for all you did to secure our freedoms that we enjoy today. Your example, your presence has made this weekend incredibly meaningful. Thank you for being here, but thank you for everything you do. Now, Paul is among the past and present members of the museum's Board of Trustees with us this evening. My thanks to all of you for your leadership, commitment to our museum. Trustees. Also want to acknowledge Stephen Watson, our President and CEO. Stephen. And of course, Dr. Nick Mueller, the museum's founding president, CEO emeritus, who spearheaded the idea of this international conference 20 years ago. Also, a shout out to all of our speakers who brought us such thought-provoking presentations, discussions. I always have little extra questions that I need to deploy in case we need them, but this year we didn't need to because the speakers did such an amazing job. So thank you, speakers. Thank you, Conference Planning Committee, for what you've done. Incredible, incredible effort. To Scott English and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Scott, I hope you enjoyed your first experience at our conference. I hope all the Pritzker members who tuned in virtually really learned a lot from the sessions we've had. Please convey our deepest appreciation to Colonel Pritzker, to Susan Rifkin, Karima Cruz, and the entire team for their support. Thank you again to Pritzker, and thank you, Scott. None of this is possible without a great team, and I'd like to just give a shout out this moment to the museum staff who pulled this together. So many members of our team are involved in making this conference the marquee adult education program of the year. My gratitude is to each of you. Let's give a shout out as they go through. Members of our AV team in the back, please wave and be recognized. They've been running all the exhibits, special events, this conference, all at the same time, and pretty amazing. I'd also like to thank our retail team for making sure all of you had the chance to buy those books. You can ship them back, you can pack them for home, so that you'll be learning about the subjects in World War II for some time. To our events team, as well as the facilities crew and security, that really helped with planning the conference, setting up tonight's event, really making it all possible. Let's give them a round of applause. Somebody's got to make dreams a reality. Thanks to our institutional advancement team, who really works with our partners all the time to make programs like this possible. So Thanks to you guys. And of course, our comrades at the Travel and Conference Department, they handle all the logistics, support, customer service, if you will, for the weekend. For those of you that have been impressed by this, you should really see what they do when they're out on the travel programs. It's absolutely incredible. So they're incredible, amazing professional teammates. Let's give the travel team a round as well. I'd also like to give a special thanks to my team at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. You know, none of this would have been possible without their tireless effort, their great ideas. They've really been on the stage and behind the scenes to make this possible. You know, thanks to all of them. Team, really appreciate all you've done. And of course, you know, a huge village here, the support from our members, the great interest that our visitors had. And with that, let's transition into a closing presentation here. So we've got, you notice in the meantime, we had two folks sneak up on stage, Henry Sledge and Rich Frank. Henry is the son of World War II veteran E.B. Sledge. He's the renowned author of China Marine, but in particular with the old breed, at Peleliu in Okinawa, which many consider the memoir of the Pacific War. Now, while growing up, Henry witnessed his father's memoirs come to life, and through many conversations with his father about his experiences in the Pacific, Henry formed a deep and abiding passion for all aspects of World War II history. So Henry Sledge's book, The Old Breed, The Complete Story Revealed, was published in June, includes his late father's unpublished writings. Now, Henry's worked as a consultant for Valor Studios, has been published in Naval History, World War II magazines. He's the co-host of What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, appeared on a guest on many others, including We Happy Few 506, Veterans Breakfast Club, War Stories, and the World War II podcast. Henry's also been on radio shows and documentary films and series, including He Has Seen War, Profiles of the Pacific, Unsung Heroes, and Against the Odds. Now, currently, Henry's been collaborating on the documentary film entitled Cowboy Down about the World War II Marine fighter pilot Major Robert Cowboy Stout and fighter squadron VMF 114. Henry's spoken at the Society of Military History, World War II Weekend, and of course previously at our International Conference on World War II here in New Orleans. He's scheduled to speak at the National Museum of the Pacific War, the Citadel, and of course here in a few minutes. He holds a bachelor's from Auburn and has over 20 years of experience in the heavy equipment industry. Yeah, I did too. I was an armor officer.
Different kind of armor.
Now, interviewing Henry tonight will be our dear friend Rich Frank. You know, Rich, really appreciate this. Rich is an internationally recognized authority on the Asia-Pacific War. His books include Guadalcanal, which many consider the best book on Guadalcanal, Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, MacArthur, and the first volume of his trilogy on the Asia-Pacific War, Tower of Skulls. Now, Rich has been a regular at the museum's conferences and symposia. He's also traveled, probably with many of you, around the world on the museum's educational travel programs. He's a founding member of the museum's Presidential Counselors Advisory Board, the folks that really helped us craft this program that you've been at this week. He's been instrumental on that, and we're always lucky to have him back with us here. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rich Frank and Henry Sledge.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. You know, every time I step on this campus, I feel like I've just stepped into a living miracle. It's such an unbelievable story, which Nick Mueller told you about yesterday, starting from Stephen Ambrose's idea he shared with Nick over some cheap sherry. As we insiders here at the museum like to say, that was the last cheap thing involved in this museum. After World War II, there were a spate of memoirs by the high and mighty like General Eisenhower, Admiral Halsey, and down through the next several decades, additional memoirs appeared by people at second and third tier and in other capacities in World War II. But one thing that was absent was something that Stephen Ambrose concentrated on, because besides the high and mighty who directed the war, he always emphasized that it was a war fought by ordinary Americans called upon to perform extraordinary things. And it was not until the 1970s that we began to get an explosion of people who were really on what we called the sharp end. And in 1981, a book appeared called With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa. Now, With the Old Breed, or the Old Breed is the nickname of the 1st Marine Division, and Peleliu and Okinawa were two important campaigns in World War II. When it was published, it was done by a man who at that point was an obscure biology professor at a small southern university who served as a very junior enlisted Marine in World War II. That memoir was swimming upstream against a real flood tide of other memoirs, but very quickly its extraordinary merit was recognized by some really distinguished scholars like John Keegan, Paul Fussell, Victor Davis Hansen, and others. And that, as Mike has alluded to, it's now regarded clearly as one of the very greatest American memoirs of World War II. And some people go further and talk about it as one of the great memoirs of war in general. And I share very much those views. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And the first thing I want to ask our audience is, how many of you have read With the Old Breed? Very good. You get a gold star on your table, or whatever here. And how many of you read it more than once? Very impressive. Well, thank you very much. Henry, I've conducted my reconnaissance, and I can report that the natives are friendly.
Well, let's hope so.
Very good. Henry, taking a cue from some of the things today, I think the first thing I would like to do is just ask you, when did you get into the idea of you were going to write something, and how did you arrive on this particular project?
Well, I was inspired to do this book actually by my mother. In the fall of 2021, I had been on some podcasts, and I went over to my mother's place where she was living at that time, and was listening to these podcasts with her, and she saw how engaged I was with my dad's story, and I always have been. And she said to me, she said, you really need to get your hands, you need to get access to that original unedited manuscript of your dad's book.
Right.
She said there's a lot of material in there that was cut out when Presidio Press published With the Old Breed in 1981. So I said, do you think there's enough to actually do something with it? She said, yeah, I do, but you're going to have to get it and really dig into it and immerse yourself with it. So she was my inspiration for doing this. And I would never be so presumptuous as to think that, anybody would be that interested in what I have to say. But when I connect with people and see how compelling With the Old Breed is for them and what it means to them, both Marines, soldiers, people who've never been in the military, there's something there that is so compelling in my dad's book. To have the opportunity to bring to life material that he wrote that didn't get published, I felt driven. I felt a moral obligation, really, to do something with that.
While we're on the subject of your mother, we talk about, Eugene, his buddies, like Sid Phillips and Bill Layden, and the people he served with, Ack and Hillbilly and whatever here. But I think beyond what you're talking about now in terms of how she guided you into this, your mother's role in all of this is something that is really fundamental to how this came to be for your father and his writing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. My mother was a very perspicacious lady. She had a deep sense of awareness of what my dad had endured. He never had any intentions of getting With the Old Breed published. He just wanted to write something for my brother and me to have as a written record, to have some understanding of what what he had seen and experienced as a Marine in the Pacific. He asked her to type what he was writing. As she told me not long before she passed away, I actually never knew this. She said, I really didn't want to do it, but he begged me to do it, so I agreed to. As she was typing it, and I mean, this went on for years, through my formative years. As she was typing his manuscript, she saw the immediacy and the power in it, and she is the one who said, Eugene, you should try to get this published. This is really powerful. He demurred at first, but she prevailed, fortunately.
Yeah, I certainly, I've read the book 4 times straight through, and excerpts of it many times. And one of the things after talking with you and learning that story, the more I've thought about what it must have been like for your mother to actually read that prose for the first time, which is so powerful to so many people over the years. And once again, your mother recognized immediately that this was not simply a family memoir. It was worthy of a much bigger stage.
Right, and I mean, her role, I think you used the word pivotal. I mean, there's no questioning that. I mean, it was her sense of awareness and appreciation and understanding the kind of man that my father was, and seeing the power of what this could be, and so with her persuasion, he agreed to try to get it published.
Right. Let me just go through now some of the very basics of the original memoir, and as we talked about, I mean, and I should emphasize to our audience is that your perspective is not just having looked at the original manuscript. There's the fact that you were the son living with him all those years. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember sitting in his study as a kid when he's writing and reading Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie, that first edition hardback cover that we've all seen so much. I remember reading that and seeing his notes that he'd made in that book that he had read, back in the early 1960s, just as he's thinking, maybe one day if I want to write down my own experience, just his thought process. And I saw that, so that it was a really interesting thing.
Yeah. And I think the first really big point that I think comes out of reading this memoir is that your father went through extraordinary events, but he had an extraordinary level of humanity that shines through in the memoir and things that you saw, whatever. You want to talk about some of the examples of that? I think particularly I think your mother had a particular story that she particularly loved.
Oh, okay, so his humanity. One of her favorite stories that he had written about, and this was when they were on Okinawa, and this did not get published in With the Old Breed. The Marines are moving up. It's before they get to Shuri, and they're moving up into a position, and of course they're passing these endless streams of refugees. And these are poor, beaten down people. They're displaced, they're scared, they're terrified. And my dad really felt a sense of suffering on their behalf. And as he and his buddies are filing through this area, this line of refugees is coming by them, and this old man with this terrified look in his face sees the helmeted conquerors, and he bows. He stands in front of my dad and he bows to him. And of course, the Marines all stop behind him, and my dad bows back to him. And it's this electric effect of the old man's face just lights up with delight, because here, the Japanese had convinced the Okinawans that these guys were going to kill their babies and eat their babies and do all these horrible things. And here's this Marine who just bowed to him. So he bows back, and my dad bows back, and they end up bowing to each other like 5 times. And then the next person comes, that man walks on the next, and then they go through the same thing again. So all my dad's buddies are like, Sledgehammer, you're going to give these people a backache. What the hell are you doing, But my mother loved that story. And so when I embarked on researching this entire manuscript that my dad had written, she said, I really hope that the part about where he bows to the old Okinawan man, that you find that was not published in With the Old Breed. Because it had been a long time, since she had read his book.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I've always been struck by that. It's interesting that they include that in the HBO miniseries, The Pacific. They seized upon that and showed that as one of the episodes when they're on Okinawa. One of the other things that certainly I was impressed upon reading the memoir is your father stressed how excellent he thought the training he got from the Marine Corps was. And in particular, I remember him emphasizing, the training, pre-deployment training, where he was, showing what the sound of Japanese weapons were.
yes.
Whatever here. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he talked about how when they got out to Noumea, to New Caledonia, they did some pretty intensive training where they dug a pit, they dug a trench, and they put 2 or 3 guys in it at a time, and then they would fire Japanese weapons over their head into the dirt embankment right behind them. Because the Marines wanted their guys to recognize the sound of enemy weapons.
Yeah.
And he felt like that was like some of the most valuable training he got, because later, as I was able to use in my book, there's a case where he and Jay Delow were pinned down on Okinawa, and they're in a trench. There's a Japanese Nambu firing at them, and the rounds are just spitting into the dirt behind them, and they're jumping around because these sizzling hot tracer rounds are coming in down in the trench with them. But he said, I realized, before we even knew for sure it was a Nambu, when we heard the sound, it kind of took us back to our training. So that was a really important aspect of one thing they did.
And and there's a thread that runs through the memoir repeatedly of the sound of Japanese weapons and the fear and terror that creates, particularly mortars,
Right.
which are one of the most. And there's a wonderful line in a dispatch by a journalist on Guadalcanal that said, "The sound of a mortar round exploding is a word spoken by death," and that, I think, really conveys exactly how terrifying it is.
Yeah, Japanese mortar fire, particularly 90 millimeter, and then they encountered 150 millimeter mortar fire quite a bit on Okinawa. Those things, he said, when they would come in and just that whispering sound, and you had no time to prepare for it. It wasn't like an artillery round where you had a little bit more, not much, but you did have some indication that you've got big rounds coming in. The mortar fire would just make this hissing sound, and then it was on you. And that was terrifying.
Yeah. One of a moment that it's in the memoir is when he's in that amphibian tractor heading in towards Peleliu, and he talks about how that's a dividing line in his whole life. Can you talk a little bit about what your father said about that?
Yeah, you're talking about the morning of D-Day at Peleliu, and my dad writes about how the world is this nightmare of snapping explosions and fragments and tracer rounds coming over them. And he says, they go down in the bowels of LST-661, and NCOs are directing them aboard various Amtraks, and you hear those things cranking up those big radial engines, and of course the tank deck is filling up with exhaust fumes, but they start out, and they show this very well in the Pacific miniseries, but he said that moment, that awesome moment that my Amtrak started into Peleliu, everything before and after pales in comparison to that moment. Like everything in his life after that was after Peleliu. That was a watershed moment for him.
Mm-hmm. And he describes, when he gets to the beach, the amphibian vehicle he's in doesn't have a ramp at the back, so he has to go over the side.
It's an LVT.
And while he goes over the side, what happens?
He goes off the left side, I believe. And I remember him telling me about this as a kid, and so I was able to write it the way he told it to me. He followed Snafu over the left side. He plants his feet to jump off to get clear of the Amtrak because they had to back up and go out and get more Marines. And just as he is about to jump, this line of tracer fire comes right by his face. He said he could literally feel the heat. And of course, he retracts his head like a turtle, and he collapses onto the sand, in his words, of just this, pile of K-bar canteens, mortar ammo bag. And I heard him say this. He said it was certainly not the way John Wayne would have hit a beach. But that was kind of his self-deprecating sense of humor. He would always point out that he was not as cool as John Wayne. But
Right. And we'll come back to the fellow known as Snafu, which Eugene spent most of his campaigns with, more time than anybody else. And we got some stories about him. And just in general, in the HBO, the Pacific, I thought the depiction of his landing on Peleliu was pretty accurate to his accounts. There's no question about that, I think.
I thought it was a really beautifully shot scene. I mean, look, I just rewatched Saving Private Ryan, and I'm always watching the Pacific. That's just constantly going on. I really think it's as good, if not better, than the iconic landing scene of Saving Private Ryan. That's just my opinion. I'm not expecting anybody that has to agree with that. But the landing at Peleliu was pretty intense.
It was very intense, yeah. I've been to that beach and walked along and thought about, what it was like for your father to be there. You got, and then when they move inland from there, things kind of get disorganized for a while and they sort of meander around, but then they finally get themselves settled for the night, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then they're looking at what?
Well, then of course, there was a good bit of confusion because the 7th Marines and the 5th Marines kind of got crossed up, due to some offshore obstacles in the water that forced the Amtrak drivers to change their course coming into the beach. But yeah, I mean, they're trying to get things sorted out and get the units back separated, 5th Marines and 7th Marines. And they end up trying to get bivouacked over pretty close to the airfield, which he's looking out at the airfield thinking we have to attack across that tomorrow.
Yeah.
The next day.
Right. And we've both been to Peleliu and we've seen that airfield.
Yeah. I mean, walking across that airfield, and I don't know if you wanted to get into this later. Now, my guide, the guy that I went with, my buddy Eric Maylander, who I talk about a lot in my book, I told him, I said, you put me on that airfield where K-35 went across, because that is literally, well, the landing beach, of course, on Orange Beach too, but where they went across the D+1, attacking across the airfield. My dad described it as fragments coming by at chariot height. He described it as probably the most terrifying experience of the war for him. And that was saying something because, all of Okinawa later.
Right. When you read all the stories later about what happens for him to classify that as the most terrifying experience. Yeah, but looking at that with a tactical eye, just imagining, obviously an airfield is just flat level. There's not a blade of grass to hide behind, much less a ditch or whatever here. And to charge across that under fire with tracers really waist high or whatever here, I think he describes it with here, that I think I would have taken annual leave that day. The other thing that struck me when I was there was in the HBO series, The Pacific. They showed that Japanese building near the airfield over here.
Building.
And it wasn't until I got to Peleliu I realized that is almost an exact replica of that exact building. So when you watch The Pacific, that building that they cluster around after they cross the airfield, that is almost an exact replica of exactly what is still there to this day.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very impressive. I think if we look at the things that your father incorporated in his memoir that are very distinctive, I mean, and I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that no one else ever wrote a good memoir. I mean, there are lots and lots of good memoirs, Marines, all the services, but I think one of the things your father did and conveyed far more starkly than anyone else was basically filth and fear. I mean, I can't think of a single memoir I've ever read where you get such a visceral sense of what it was like to experience those things or whatever here.
Well, when you say that, it makes me think, like, we have heard some amazing presentations in the last couple of days of things speaking from the top down, from the bottom up.
Right.
a grand geopolitical strategy, grand military strategy, tactics. When you study my dad's memoir, you are descending into the chasm, the maw, the abyss of close personal combat. You're going to see, you experience when you read his book, and you have even more detail that I was able to unearth in the unpublished material, truly what an abyss of despair and hopelessness it is to go through that experience. I hope everybody's having a lovely evening, by the way. But you sense that with him, and he was not afraid to admit how terrified he was. I remember him telling me a conversation he had with Hillbilly Jones, like the third night on Peleliu, and he told Hillbilly, he said, you know, I don't remember exactly how he expressed it, but he expressed disappointment in himself that he was as scared as he was. And Hillbilly said, Sledgehammer, everybody's scared, it's just you don't mind admitting it, and a lot of these guys won't admit it.
Exactly. The other thing that other component is, you know, the extremely visceral description of just the sheer filth of the battlefield with the debris, the bodies, the flies,
Right.
all this stuff. Very few memoirs get that graphic as your father did in his memoir. Do you remember any moments when he was writing that particular type of thing that you saw?
You know, he always felt, he said this to me, and then he said it in the stuff that was edited out of With the Old Breed that I was very fortunate to be able to use myself. He felt it was a disservice to the infantryman experience, that memoirs, and certainly the movies of the day, glossed over the utter depravity of that life of being an infantryman.
Yeah.
And he went over it and over it and over it because he felt like if you know, this is, being in combat it's not tales of dashing, daring do, which is what, you know, newspapers wanted to report that way. It is trembling in your foxhole, being utterly terrified, shells crashing around you, you know, and he went on and on about the filth and just the total lack of sanitation and ability to get yourself clean, because that was such a big part of the experience to him.
Yeah. It's, and like I said, you know, it is very much that. And the other thing, there's two things about movies or visual depictions of these things is they never convey how loud a firefight can be. The sound level is just, you know, beyond what they can manage in Hollywood. And the other thing that never is really conveyed in those visual images is the smells. And with your father's memoir, you know, I think for any of us who've been in any combat, I mean, when he talks about those things, you remember exactly that
Yeah, well,
sensory.
it is so graphic, and I mean, look, I talked to a lot of groups, I talked to a lot of Marines, and when I first started out doing this kind of thing, you know, especially talking to Marines, I was always a little bit shy because the first thing I wanted to say was, look, I've never humped a pack and a rifle. I've never been in combat. I can't speak to that experience personally, but I knew a guy.
Yeah.
You know, and when I engage with his story and I have the passion for it that I had, and talking to my dad and hearing these things out of his own mouth, I mean, it really made a lasting impression on me, both to hear it from him and then to read it when With the Old Breed was published, and I was like 15 or 16.
Yeah. Let's talk about how your father, one of the things that's so striking is his ability to recall and describe exactly what he went through. Mm-hmm. And famously, of course, he made notes in the Bible, but that wasn't the only place where he recorded some of his memories or memory probably more accurate to describe them as memory joggers or whatever.
Right.
That was how he did it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Marines were forbidden from keeping diaries, but he had his Bible, which is over there. As they show in the Pacific miniseries, you know, he kept notes. He wrote a little bit in the margins, not a lot. I think mostly what he wrote on was little scraps of paper that he kept tucked into the pages of the Bible. I think it was probably range cards, because every time they'd crack open a case of 60 shells, they've got those range cards. I think he was using range cards to scribble things down on the back.
Right.
But that Bible was his constant companion through the entire thing, and so coming home from the war, I mean, he sat down and took that and on a piece of legal paper, on a legal pad, made an outline in more detail of all that he had made these notes of, times, dates, places, weather conditions, things like that.
I know you witnessed as a child him writing the thing, but you know how long he worked on the memoir before he even began looking for a publisher?
Oh, he started, I've talked a lot about, I remember being 3 and 4 years old, getting up in the middle of the night, and he's in there, by the fireplace, scribbling away on a yellow legal pad. He always wrote on yellow legal pads, and he always wrote in pencil. And I remember that from the earliest years of my childhood, and I saw that stack of legal pads just gradually get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, my mom started, he did talk her into, he begged her to type it. And she began doing that. And so, my brother and me, our formative years are watching her clacking away on that typewriter and him writing at night. And there were times he might go weeks and weeks and not work on it at all. And then he'd get into a groove and he'd really stay with it and stay focused. And a lot of that just had to do with how busy he was with his job or with family things going on or what have you. But seeing that was really just a huge part of my childhood. I've always said my dad's book is woven into the fabric of my DNA because I watched it come to life.
Yeah. And certainly one of the things I think that's striking about your book is that you show how your father, all those episodes that are either in the book or in the manuscript, right. Some of which are in the HBO miniseries, but he used those as sort of a text for teaching lessons and making comments and things like that about those particular experiences.
Yeah, that was after I got the manuscript done, and literally you and John McManus were the first two people who, you guys were like my main advisors. And I thought that the best thing about, and I still think, the best thing about me being able to do that book was being able to bring that material that he wrote, his own words, that got edited out, bring more to the story. But friends of mine who read the manuscript, my wife even helping me understand this, like my own voice stringing together those bits of unpublished material, you're seeing how this World War II veteran processed his trauma, processed his experience as being a Marine in World War II, and also how that experience, how it influenced him to be the husband and the father that I grew up knowing. And I think that's a huge part of the story because he talked about it so much. And the Eugene Sledge story is a happy story in the sense that, when you look at the trauma that he went through and what he had to try to process and deal with, for me, for my family, for my brother, it really was a positive thing because he would remember the pleasant things with guys like Snafu and George Surratt and Bill Layden, and I say in my book, I never felt like I was living in a home with this disturbed individual. You never heard my brother and me saying, "Hey man, Dad's kind of volatile, you might want to leave him alone." We never had conversations like that because we didn't have to. Yeah. He compartmentalized, and I know he was dealing with a lot, but he compartmentalized that because he was so determined to make sure that that my mom and my brother and me had a happy home to grow up in and to live in. And yet we still saw the specter looming large of his having been a Marine and fighting the Japanese.
Right. Well, that sort of gets to, I think, one of the things that what you have done is so valuable beyond just the material that was not published. Anyone who reads that memoir, and only that memoir, you end it and you're wondering, what kind of a life would this person have had after these experiences, and you answer that question in your book, which is one of the most important things I think you do. And while we're on that, what are some of the some of the stories, some of the events that are in the unpublished memoir that you particularly thought were relevant to insights about your dad?
Oh, well, I mean, there's some great stuff about Snafu. You know, one of my...
Let me just say that for those of you, Snafu was the nickname of Muriel Schulten, who was the corporal in charge of the 60-millimeter mortar. He spent more time with Snafu than any other Marine, at least in combat, right over here. And Snafu's, he's a central character, obviously, in the whole with the old breed or whatever here. But yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. So Rami Malek, of course, played him brilliantly in the Pacific. But there was this little bit where they're near Hill 140 on Peleliu. And of course, you know, as the sun's going down, smoke and lamp is out, you know, very strict because of Japanese infiltrators and snipers, always a threat on Peleliu.
The smoke lamp is out means no cigarettes, no open flames or whatever here. That
right.
Okay.
And Snafu was really upset on this particular occasion because he hadn't had his after digging in cigarette. They would dig in for the night, stack their mortar shells, make sure they're sighted in, and then prepare for, as he described it, always a long night on Peleliu, fighting off infiltrators or dealing with anything like that. And so after they would dig in for the night, Snafu would have his traditional after digging in cigarette. Well, this particular night, he didn't have time to have it, so Snafu was extremely upset about that. So he's like, Sledgehammer, put this poncho over me while I smoke a cigarette. So my dad takes a Snafu's poncho and puts it over him. And then the way my dad writes it, he's treated to this episode of comedic relief because Snafu's, you know, he sees the thing undulating up and down because Snafu's, you know, moving around trying to get into position to light his cigarette, which he wasn't able to do for several minutes. So he sees this thing like this, and Snafu's grumbling and cursing in his distinct Louisiana accent, as my dad always said. And he said finally he could see little puffs of smoke coming out from under the poncho, and Snafu calmed down because he was getting a cigarette. But that was a humorous story. Yeah. You know, there was another great story. There were so many, like things that I couldn't believe got edited out of With the Old Breed. And there was a great story on Okinawa. I think they were past Shuri. It was pretty close to Kanishi Ridge. And of course, constant, you know, streams of civilians coming through their area at night. One particular occasion, they're putting the flare shells up, and they see some Okinawan civilians coming through. And I think the way this happened was there were two Japanese infiltrators dressed as old men in amongst them, and they had kimonos over them or whatever. And somebody shouted, the women and children started screaming, and these Japanese soldiers came up and started shooting at them. Well, then they unleashed on them with a machine gun and ended up killing those guys. A little 4-year-old girl was wounded when that happened in her calf. Not seriously, but my dad, and I think he was dug in with George Surratt that night, they take her into their foxhole and feed her chocolate rations and, you know, try to comfort her until a corpsman could get up there to her, and then they handed her off to adults the next day. But that's just one quick little episode of something I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, one of the things about your father's experience, the Peleliu and Okinawa was very different in many ways over here. And probably the single biggest difference was on Okinawa, excuse me, they were dealing with literally, the Marines and the Army were dealing with, you know, literally thousands of these refugees. And of course, the Okinawans had been inculcated by the Japanese with the notion that if they fell into American hands, they'd be tortured, raped, killed, or whatever here. So most of the Okinawans, at least initially, tended to retreat with the Japanese, and then later on, you began to get surrenders coming out or whatever here. But it made it very distinctive because they were, as you said, like that episode, you know, at night if they tried to cross the lines, that was extremely risky, to say the least.
Yeah, there was some great stuff from Okinawa, which, I mean, he was in 82 days at Okinawa compared to 30, 31, 32 days at Peleliu. So obviously there was going to be more material that he had written about on Okinawa, but there were some incredible things that I really couldn't believe got edited out of With the Old Breed on the first go. Twice a Japanese 150 millimeter mortar shell landing very close to him that was a dud. And like he said, it was like a motorboat plowing through the dirt hill when this 150 millimeter shell came through. It was a dud, and it's just lying there hissing, and of course they're all looking at it like, good God, what's about to happen now, because they thought it could still explode. But that happened twice.
Yeah. And one of those that actually threw mud on your father or whatever?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
did. I mean,
yeah.
the shell comes crashing through. When it hits, it just sprays them all with mud. And they look out there, and he said that 150 millimeter Japanese mortar shell looked as big as a Higgins boat.
Yeah. That's, it makes me immediately think about this episode on Peleliu, where it's after the charge across the airfield, and he's in conversation with Hillbilly and one other Marine, and hears that voice saying, "You will survive."
Right, that was the Sergeant Teskovich.
Yeah. Can you talk about that episode?
Yeah, so sadly, my mom, the source of inspiration for me to do this book, she did not live long enough to see it come to fruition, but we had a lot of conversations, as I was writing it. And I talked to her about that, and she said, so what Rich is referring to is, I think it's the third night at Peleliu, and so it's around twilight. They've already dug in. Hillbilly, Sergeant Teskovich, my dad, they're sitting on the edge of a foxhole having a conversation. This is, of course, my dad's baptism of fire. Hillbilly had been at Cape Gloucester, I believe. Teskovich had also been at Cape Gloucester. So they had a good bit of combat experience. So my father is trying to, just kind of feel them out and get a sense of, is this about what you expected? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Do you think we're going to win? What do you think is going to happen? And they're talking, and, Hillbilly was talking in his soft Southern accent, because my dad talked about, it was very distinctive. Sergeant Teskovich was from the Northeast and had this real hard Northeastern accent, but they were both, he felt really good talking to these guys because they were both really experienced combat Marines. And then he hears this voice, "You will survive the war." And talking to my mom about it, she said, I think he just got so much comfort from that at such a difficult time in his life. And he says, and With the Old Breed, he said, I'm not one to believe in visions and that kind of thing, but he said, I really felt like a higher power was speaking to me in that moment, because Teskovich and Hillbilly did not hear anything. Because he said, did you guys hear that? Did you just hear a voice? And they both ended up getting killed on Peleliu.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of premonition thing, or hearing a voice saying something or whatever here. You find that wrapped through a number of memoirs or whatever here. And it's, and in terms of, the way I was born and raised, I'm always very skeptical about those sorts of stories or whatever here. But I actually had an experience in Vietnam where the company I had was guarding this pier on Da Nang, and one day I had this overwhelming sense that night was going to be the night that we were going to be attacked. Mm-hmm. I went through the whole day thinking that, and then in the evening I got in my Jeep and I drove around to about every outpost we had, and then I got back to my quarters after midnight, and I always had my gear, I would usually take my boots off on an average night, but that night I didn't take my boots off. Mm-hmm. I had everything arranged, and sure enough, landline road, and they came that night, So when I read that in your father's memoir, I was thinking, this is not an experience that I didn't know a little bit about.
Yeah, you had that sense of foreboding.
Right, exactly, and it actually came to fruition. This whole environmental thing about Okinawa with all those civilians, in the whole Pacific War, the number of occasions where Marines or Army, for that matter, until we got to the Philippines, where there were very large numbers of Filipino civilians, was very unusual. You have a little bit of that in the Marianas or whatever, but most of these other locations like Guadalcanal, you have some of the locals are there, but they don't have the presence that made Okinawa so distinctive or whatever here, and made it much harder. And what I'm sort of heading to is one of the other things that's very distinctive about fighting in the Pacific was that the Japanese tried to make every night a nightmare with their infiltration tactics or whatever here. And what when you read that and you envision yourself in that, you go through a whole day, very exhausting, just humping gear or whatever, or marching or walking or whatever here, and then you get to the evening, and you're going to be on watch, usually 2 or 3 guys, and then 1 guy on watch at a time or whatever here. But day after day after day of that, and then during the night, you've got to be absolutely hyper alert to the fact that this could be the night that somebody comes by. There's some nights I think you described in your account that almost the whole company stayed up all night because there were so many of these infiltrators coming around.
Yeah, he said we attacked all day and fought them all night. I mean, and he always, I don't remember him complaining about that to me so many times. The way the Japanese moved around at night constantly to keep them on edge. And I think so. One of my things I was able to kind of tie back to in my experience growing up was just, as a kid, I remember he was obsessed with making sure I got enough sleep at night. Constantly, you need to get to bed. He was always on me about that. God, I got so sick of hearing it. But I understand, researching and reading with the old breed and then researching the unpublished stuff. I mean, the Japanese were masters at exploiting that and keeping the Marines and the soldiers as active as they could at night. And there were cases on Peleliu where you had, back in the caves of the Brogel, you had the Japanese who were fighting and attacking during the day, but they had squads bivouacked back in the caves, sleeping during the day, so then they came out at night, to constantly harass the Marines.
And I remember there's one occasion your father was talking about he was so tired he was literally physically trying to hold his eyes open.
That was on Okinawa. He talked about how it was, because it was unforgivable, 2 men to a hole. Your buddy was depending on you. If you had the watch, he was going to get the closest thing you could get to sleep in that environment, and it was your responsibility to stay awake and be on watch. And that was the sacrosanct code that these guys had to observe, because they literally were putting their lives in each other's hands. But yeah, I mean, there were times on Okinawa, he talked about how being so mentally fatigued, so physically fatigued, that it was like I felt like I could have taken matchsticks to prop my eyes open, because just the utter sense of fatigue was overwhelming.
Yeah, and this takes us into one of the really notable episodes in the memoir, and that you found out some more important information. That's the night where the fellow he described as the dog handler sort of went off his rocker and began making a lot of noise, and then they had to deal with that situation.
Yeah, that was the mangrove swamp on Peleliu. And I visited that spot when I was there in 1999. But yeah, there was a 40-man patrol. They were sent out to the southeastern promontory to probe Japanese strength. And they showed in the Pacific, but the dog handler just had snapped. He had emotionally and mentally snapped, and they end up having to hit him. One of the guys ends up having to hit him with an entrenching tool, just like we saw in the Pacific. But my dad talked about how Major Gustafsson was with them that night.
He was the battalion commander at that time?
Yes, I believe that's correct. Yeah. He was 3rd Battalion commander. So Hillbilly called back to Major Gustafsson on the radio and said, look, we had a really bad, the next morning, we had a pretty bad night last night. I think I need to bring these guys in. And Gus, as they call him, his code name was Gus, Major Gustafsson, they could hear Hillbilly on the radio, because my dad was dug in pretty close to what passed for their CP that night.
Yeah.
And they could hear Gus politely questioning Hillbilly, like, we really need you to probe for enemy strength because we think there's a lot of Japs out there on that part that are going to come down from the Brogel. And my dad talked about how Hillbilly was very polite but very firm, saying, Gus, we had a bad night. I need to bring these guys in. And so Major Gustafson said, okay, I'll send a relief column with a tank to help you come in case you have any trouble. So that really was a moment where they felt this sense of love for Hillbilly because he was reporting the situation as he had to report it, but he was looking out for them too.
Right.
And just saying, look, we need to come in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a very instructive episode about combat command because to me, what rings through with that is that Gus, the battalion commander, in his role, I mean, he had reason to question, but
Sure.
he did so. You know, he obviously had a lot of respect for Hillbilly, and when he talked with Hillbilly, and Hillbilly was insistent that this is what I think we ought to do, Gus said, "That's it."
That was the crux of it, was the respect that the major had for Lieutenant Jones.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the other officer figure who really stands out, obviously, in the memoir is Akak, or
Certainly.
Captain Haldane. Can you talk a little bit about him and what your father said about him later?
Well, I mean, you know, as I've said this before, I mean, the names like Hillbilly and Snafu and Akak, those were literally part of my growing up. I mean, the love that they had for Captain Haldane was really palpable, you know, because Captain Haldane was the kind of officer who he didn't yell at or berate his men. He ruled firmly, but very compassionately. But it was really a moving episode. It was in With the Old Breed, but I was able to find a little bit of detail that got edited out that I could use in my book when they're on Pavuvu and that they'd been out training all day and they're headed back to their camp and they're tired, they're hungry, a late afternoon thunderstorm, which they would frequently get these monsoon rains on Pavuvu, and they get hit with one of those, and so, you know, trucks and tanks are just clanking by them and the guys are just trudging wearily through the mud, and he sees this big guy come walking along the line. And big guy, you know, Akak was 5'11", the same height that my 17-year-old is. But he's a pretty well-built guy, you know. And here comes Captain Haldane, and he's just walking along the line, offering encouragement and talking to these Marines as he's going by. And he stops and he talks to my dad for a few minutes and says, you're a Southerner, aren't you? You're from Mobile? Or my dad said, yes, sir, I'm from Mobile. And they talk for a few minutes. And then Captain Haldane cordially, you know, wishes him luck and moves on down the line talking to other Marines. But the way my father described that, he said, Akak he made us feel like we were human beings and not caged animals being trained to fight. Mm-hmm. And there was a great story that didn't get published in With the Old Breed that I could use where the company officers would get the companies out in the street of their camp and do inspections of all their gear. And the Marines would have to lay all the gear out on their bunks or whatever to be inspected. And while they were lined up to do that, one of the monsoon rains came up, and Akak said, take them inside, do the inspection in their tents. The neighboring company had as he described it, a martinet-type company commander who made them stand at attention in this pouring rain. And he said, you know, we sat on our bunks and felt very fortunate that we had Captain Haldane as our CO. But Akak was a seminal figure to my dad. I mean, through my entire life, I've heard stories about Akak.
Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, you can read With the Old Breed and the accounts about Akak, and then in your book also, it's almost like an instruction manual about how to be an effective company commander. You got to get the mission done, you got to be firm, you got to be fair, but you got to show that you really have full regard for the men under you.
Full regard for the men, but, you know, he would tolerate no doping off, as my dad said. They use that expression sometimes. I mean, he expected his men to do what they were told, and they did, you know, because they had a profound sense of respect for him. But, you know, of course, tragically, Akak is killed on Hill 140 early, I think it's October 7th of 44. And of course, that's shown in the Pacific. It was just a moment. I mean, my dad said it was the worst grief I suffered during the entire war because he represented stability. He was this bedrock of stability to some of us who were so young. I mean, he was really like a father figure. And it's crazy to think that because he was only 27.
Right.
You know, but so many of these Marines are 18, 19 years old, you know. And so losing Ack was a really horrible moment for him. But he contrasts that. There was a lot of stuff that got edited out of With the Old Breed on Okinawa, where they had another company commander at that point in time, not Lieutenant Stanley. Stumpy was awesome. I remember talking to Stumpy on the phone, and my dad thought the world of Lieutenant Stanley. But they did have another company commander for a while who was the antithesis of Ack. You know, he would yell at these guys, he would berate them. And I mean, these are combat-hardened Marines. They have seen, in some cases, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, now Okinawa. They've seen the worst of the worst. And they didn't take kindly to being unnecessarily yelled at, you know, by an officer who they did not respect.
Exactly. But in terms of your father's life and fate in the Marine Corps, it was much more controlled by the NCOs that he was serving with and under.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about those people and what he thought about them?
I mean, he felt like they had really great NCOs. You know, Bergen was a seminal figure there. Of course, he was wounded later on Okinawa, but did come back to K Company. Sergeant Teskovich, which of course Teskovich was killed on Peleliu. But I think there was a conversation when they were about to ship out for Peleliu when one of my dad's buddies says, it's the NCOs who run things when the stuff hits the fan.
Yeah.
You know, it's not these boot lieutenants.
Yeah. And that's the way it always is, really, you know. You know, when you actually go to Peleliu.
Mike's over there looking. We love lieutenants. It's not that.
When you actually go to Peleliu and you see the Bruegel, you know, it's just, in my, you know, I was putting my eye over it or whatever. I found it hard to imagine, A, how I would have maneuvered people, right, and B, how I would have attacked anything there in those up and down, in those little narrow valleys or whatever here. My mind kept saying, how did they do it? How did they do it? You know, it's just, it's so oppressive to see exactly what Peleliu was really like.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my dad saying the ruggedness of the terrain was, and I think this is the way I wrote it in my book, because I was actually quoting a conversation I had with him. He said, Americans had never seen anything like this. The topography was so complex. Box canyons, ravines, you know, and of course the Japanese exploited that. Colonel Nakagawa was just a tactical genius and exploited
Right.
it to a great degree with like 500 fortified caves or something like that. But I remember my dad telling me, you know, I'll tell you how we couldn't have taken Peleliu if it hadn't been for napalm. Mm-hmm. And the horrific weapon that the flamethrower was, I mean, it was pretty necessary in that type of blowtorch and corkscrew combat, which is the phrase I've seen applied to Peleliu.
Right, right, yeah. And of course, as we talked about, that's where Ack is killed. He's going up to do a reconnaissance.
Yeah, Hill 140.
Yeah, it's all I can say is that, you know, when you read With the Old Breed and see the HBO miniseries where they depict that or whatever here, that's some of the most god-awful places to have fought in World War II. With that much confused high ground around at all sides, it's like you can't maintain a solid front.
Right.
So you're always going to have somebody ahead, somebody behind, and the Japanese on either side or behind you or whatever here. Clearly one of the toughest fights that the Marines had, and of course that's why the 1st Marine Division was basically wrecked on Peleliu.
Certainly.
The casualty level.
The 1st Marines were taken off after a pretty short time because they'd been shot to pieces. And then the 7th Marines took their turn, and then the 5th Marines, which was my father's regiment. Peleliu was no place to do frontal assaults. And Then you get into the whole question of Chesty Puller, who I realize is this iconic Marine, deservedly so. I think that my father, of course, Puller was not his regimental commander. Bucky Harris was, and my father had a great deal of respect for Bucky Harris because, in fact, I saw a letter in the archives at Auburn that he had written to Colonel Harris after the war, because Bucky Harris was the one who said, wait a minute, we can't be charging these damn caves with bayonets fixed. That's suicidal to our Marines. So what he advocated doing was really a more methodical approach, which was, advance under sandbags, pound it with artillery to reduce these positions.
Yeah.
And my dad felt like Bucky Harris was, because the 5th Marines actually had, not by a lot, but they had fewer casualties than the 7th, and certainly fewer than the 1st Marine Regiment. But he felt like Bucky Harris was pretty instrumental to that.
And for sure, I think there's no doubt about that. The other thing that with Peleliu, you get into the question of the division commander, General Rupertus, and I know from reading your book, I don't think it was clear in with the old breed as I remember, but the word filtered down to the Marines at the lowest level about how Rupertus refused to ask for the Army to come in and help.
Right. And I actually wrote an article for World War II magazine, and I consulted with our buddy John McManus on this, and that's John talks a lot, and he and John Curatola talked about this today. In the Pacific, you really had pretty good cooperation between the Marines and the Army. I mean, yes, there was inter-service rivalry. You're going to have that. But despite that, when it came down to it, Saipan being an exception, of course, with the Smith-Smith controversy, when the Marines and the Army fought together, they usually did pretty well.
Yeah, and in your account, there was one particular episode I thought was instructive, was when your dad's talking to that Army tanker.
Yeah.
And that.
Yeah, that's on Okinawa. So they're dug in. They see about 3 Army Shermans come clanking up, and they shut the tanks down, and the guys get out and start doing maintenance chores on their tanks. And my dad just goes over, because it was a quiet day, a quiet area at that point in time. And he goes over and sits on his helmet and just starts talking to him. And these Army tankers were really friendly guys, and they were struck up a conversation with him. And the guy said, yeah, we're about to, we were supporting a Marine unit, now we're about to go back and get back with supporting an Army division. And my dad said, well, I guess you're pretty glad of that. And this Army tanker said, why? Why do you say that? And he said, because, everybody says Marines are just drive, thoughtlessly aggressive, just push. And this Army tanker said, buddy, you guys got a great outfit. He said, when we're supporting Marines, we love supporting Marines because if one unit pulls back, everybody pulls back together. It's not because he was referring to, I think it was Kakuzu Ridge, where a bunch of Army tanks got stranded out by some retreating infantrymen. And of course, there was that symbiotic relationship between the tankers and the infantrymen. They needed each other to protect each other. And you had a case of, I think the infantry had to pull back, the tanks got stuck out there, and the Japanese knocked out some incredible number. I want to say it was maybe 22 tanks got knocked out.
Something like that, yeah.
At Kakuzu Ridge. But no, this Army tanker said, man, I like working with Marines.
We're going to end it on that, and I wanted to make sure that we don't tell the complete story because that is in Henry's book. I've got to add a point to this. I got Henry's manuscript with John Curatola. He sent it to us, and I was reading it as a historian, reading it having read your father's book, and then I realized it was the time that your mother and my father were both passing, and it's a father-son story as much as it is a history story, and it meant a lot to me. You mean a lot to me. Rich, you always mean a lot to us, but this has been a great night for me. Thank you for coming back, Henry. Thank you, Andrea and Jack. Please wave, Andrea and Jack, for being a part of this legacy. Yeah. Thank you.
So thanks, Rich and Henry. I heard you talking about tankers, so I had to kind of sneak up
All
here.
good stuff. Army tankers are great.
Yeah. Thank you for the personal, the in-depth understanding, the appreciation of your father that, most of us only know from his book. Now, Henry's going to be over there signing copies of his book, which you can buy. You can stand in line, you can get them signed. But you also have a little special treat over there. You got Corporal Eugene Sledge's annotated National Edition of the New Testament, Psalms from 1944, which the family has loaned to the museum. You also have his utility cap and his model 1911 45 caliber pistol, both of which we're honored to have donated to the National World War II Museum so that we may care for those priceless artifacts and really share Eugene Sledge's story for generations to come. You know, those artifacts soon will have a place in the Forbes Rare and Iconic Artifacts Gallery in the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion. They're really an honored place as we go forward. So before we close completely, let's give Rich and Henry a round of applause. Thank you. This concludes the 18th International Conference on World War II. Thanks to all of you for being here, all of you at home who've watched. Godspeed. Please share links to the sessions with your friends and family. You know, they'll be available on the museum's YouTube channel. We've got a patent symposium coming up in March. We've got other great stuff. We've got next year's 19th International Conference. With that, Godspeed and God bless. Thank you again. I had to sneak up there.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.